Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us. My name is Amanda Kramer, and I am the Alumni Engagement Program Manager at the University of Colorado Boulder's Leeds School of Business. These are certainly trying times, and here at CU Boulder, we have gathered our world-renowned faculty and alumni to provide frank and timely insights for life during and after the COVID-19 pandemic. Today is the fifth of 7 webinars in this final spring COVID-19 related webinar series. To view upcoming webinars, please visit our website at colorado.edu/business/alumni. Click the drop-down arrow and click Attend Online Webinars. For today's webinar, we're excited to have CU Boulder Professor of Distinction in the Department of History, Dr. Susan Kent, here presenting Lessons from the 1918-1919 Influenza Pandemic. A few housekeeping items before we begin. First, if you have any questions now or during the presentation that you would like to ask Susan, please send a question through the Q&A interface. We will monitor questions as they are submitted, and Susan will respond to them at the end of the presentation. As a reminder, for optimum audio quality, we do have everyone on mute except for myself and our speaker. If you experience any technical difficulties during the webinar, please notify us through the chat interface, and one of our support specialists will touch base. Lastly, a link to access the webinar recording will be sent to all registrants tomorrow, along with a survey link and supplemental resources from today's presentation. Now, I am so excited to introduce today's speaker. Susan Kingsley Kent is a professor of distinction in the Department of History. She has written numerous books treating gender, war, politics, and culture in Britain, the British Empire, and across the globe. Welcome, Susan, and thank you so much for being here. I'm going to hand the webinar controls over to you now.
The influenza pandemic of 1918-1919 killed at least 50 and perhaps as many as 100 million people throughout the world in the space of little more than 6 months. Appearing in the midst of the Great War, it proved to be more lethal than any other disease since the visitation of the Black Death in the 14th century. And it killed more people than any other single event of the 20th century, save the Second World War. George Newman, Chief Medical Officer of Great Britain's Ministry of Health, called it one of the great historic scourges of our time, a pestilence which affected the well-being of millions of men and women and destroyed more human lives in a few months than did the European War in 5 years. It appeared with explosive suddenness, he said, and simply had its way. It came like a thief in the night and stole treasure. Doctors estimated that 800 of 1,000 persons contracted only a mild case of the flu, but of the other 200 severely afflicted, some 80% of them died. The flu wreaked its havoc on military and civilian populations throughout the world in 3 waves. Appearing first in the American Midwest in the late winter and early spring of 1918, it spread from Camp Funston outside of Fort Riley, Kansas, to Camp Oglethorpe in Georgia, and thence rapidly to Europe on board the troop ships transporting American forces to the Western Front. Contemporaries called it the Spanish flu, mistakenly believing that it had originated in Spain. It had not, but Spain was one of the few countries in Europe that had not imposed an embargo on information emanating from its borders and allowed news reports of illness there to disseminate. The other countries, engaged in a bloody, brutal, horrific war of attrition, censored what could be put out and were quick to jump on Spain as the source of what would prove to be a terrible killer. An exhausted, emotionally and physically stressed European population proved no match for the illness, which marched through the continent en route to Asia and Africa and arrived in Australasia in July. This first incident caused little alarm, as it was a fairly mild strain, pardon me, and killed no more than the usual number of influenza victims. But it was followed by an onslaught of unprecedented force. In mid-August, the virus mutated, and the second wave began to make itself felt, moving speedily along commercial and military transportation routes across the globe, leaving no one untouched. The second wave of the flu appeared in Brest, on the northwest coast of France, around August 22nd. Brest served as the disembarkation port for the American Expeditionary Force, some 800,000 strong. Some days later, influenza appeared in Boston, the port from which a large portion of the American forces embarked en route to France. As arriving troops moved into their camps and then made their way to the front, the virus moved with them, inflicting a heavy toll in illness and deaths among the fighting forces and the hard-pressed civilian populations of Europe. From Russia, the flu moved into Asia. It entered India through the port of Bombay in October. It made its way to Australia, New Zealand, and the Pacific Islands by November and December. From Boston, the flu traveled westward across the American continent and was carried aboard ship to the Caribbean and to Central and South America. No part of the world escaped unscathed. The third wave of influenza reappeared in February 1919. Less virulent than the second wave, it nevertheless took its toll on already devastated populations. Combatants on the Western Front suffered particularly harsh attacks. Laid low by fever and then by opportunistic pneumonia that took advantage of the weakened conditions of the soldiers, thousands upon thousands of them had to be invalided to the rear areas. The US forces suffered more deaths from the flu in October 1918, at the height of their offensive against the Germans, than from battle. After the armistice in November 1918, the incidence of cases declined, but sprang back again in January and February of 1919. By the middle of 1919, the virus had disappeared, probably because it had tapped into all of the human hosts available to it and burned itself out. The particular configurations of this influenza virus were a product of the war. The conditions of this war enabled a common and usually mild disease to mutate into a deadly strain that spread like wildfire across the globe, killing not only the weakest in the population, but the very strongest as well. Taking advantage of thousands of people congregating together in army camps and hospitals, moving constantly in and out of contact with others, and subject to conditions in the trenches that weakened their immune systems, this flu took on a character unprecedented in its impact. Flu viruses mutate regularly, but most of the viruses do not survive long enough for the changes to take effect. In ordinary conditions, a virus that mutated into a particularly deadly strain would not have sufficient hosts to sustain itself. It would kill off its hosts too quickly to be able to reproduce and pass on its characteristics. But the conditions of warfare in 1918 ensured that sufficient hosts, healthy young men, were continuously made available so that the virus could survive to reproduce. As soldiers fell ill, they were brought to the rear areas and replaced by others who rotated into the camps and trenches. The camps and trenches were thus filled with men who had been infected with the virus but were not yet sick, and men who had not yet been exposed to the virus to whom they could transmit it. A steady and constant supply of non-infected troops arrived to succor the virus, ensuring that its terrible virulence was not exterminated by the elimination of hosts. Without the particular circumstances thrown up by the war, the virulent strain of influenza would not have been able to maintain its presence and take down so many victims. So I want you to take a look at the ages of people who suffered most heavily, who died most in greatest numbers from the flu. And you'll see that the greatest numbers lie in the ages of 15 to 65, with the greatest number of them at the ages of people at the prime of their life. This is not the way ordinary flu viruses operate. They usually take the very young and the very old, and the people in the middle tend to survive. The flu left survivors with a variety of mental symptoms, many of them represented by physicians and the press in terms similar to those used to describe sufferers of shell shock coming out of the Great War. One writer, for instance, noted the plague of nervous character, as she put it, following the onslaught of influenza. Pronounced fatigue, lassitude, depression, sleeplessness, hallucinations, emotional lability, and even dissociation accompanied the physical debilitation of the disease. One doctor wrote to the British Medical Journal in August of 1918 that, quote, mental symptoms were frequent in the cases he saw. Yet another informed readers of The Lancet in February of 1919 that the depression which follows influenza is so constant that it ought to be regarded as part of the disease. The medical correspondent for the London Times, having contracted the illness himself, advised readers that the most distressing symptom was a swift loss of mental capacity, and then an inability to think coherently. Yet another set of physicians, writing in 1919, noted that all forms of hysteria have been observed after influenza. Hysteria, you might not know, is what we would today refer to as post-traumatic stress disorder. So all forms of hysteria have been observed after influenza, they wrote. Hysterical convulsions, hysterical and epileptic attacks. Post-influenza neurasthenia is very familiar, they noted. Post-influenza psychoses frequently observed and reported. British writer, novelist Ivy Compton Burnett came down with the flu in the summer of 1918 and was discovered by mere chance lying unconscious on the floor of her flat. She exhibited delirium, and when she recovered from the disease, she wrote that extreme debility, I'm unable to read or write. She asked to be read to, but could not tolerate any kind of stimulus, telling her sister to please read, but don't put any expression into it. Read in a dull, monotonous voice. She took up mindless tasks as her recovery progressed, but as she put it, I couldn't do brain work. This will become important a little bit down the road. The mortality figures for the flu pandemic beggar the imagination. Where influenza epidemics in the past produced death rates of about 0.1% of those infected, this one killed 2.5% of those infected. Britain lost 250,000 people to the disease. France and Germany each saw about the same number of deaths. 450,000 inhabitants of the Russian Empire died as disease combined with both revolution and civil war to decimate the population. 675,000 Americans died, 50,000 Canadians, and in fact, the death rates in the United States were so high that life expectancy dropped by 12 years in 1918 alone as a consequence of the huge number of deaths recorded that year. Indigenous peoples in North and South America and in Australia and New Zealand suffered disproportionate mortality rates. Some communities in indigenous areas lost upwards of 80% of their members. Africans died in greater numbers than did Europeans. Where Europeans experienced mortality rates of 1% to 2% or so, African death rates reached upwards of 5% of the population. South Africa lost about 280,000 people. But Asia was hit hardest of all. India alone suffering the loss of at least 6 million and perhaps as many as 15 million people. Indonesian deaths reached 1.5 million. White New Zealanders had a death rate of about 5.8 per thousand, while the indigenous Maori population of New Zealand died at a rate 7 times higher. China and Japan appear to have weathered the illness better than most other countries, probably owing to the use of traditional medicinal remedies that had the effect of lowering fever and ameliorating the stress on the immune system. Shanghai's death rate, for instance, seems to have been as low as about 1.3 per thousand. Now, it's virtually impossible to know the death rate across China as a whole, as records simply do not exist that might reveal it. But those documents that we do have available to us show a far lower incidence of death than occurred in other parts of the world. And again, unlike its predecessors, which tended to take infants and the elderly, this strain of influenza preferred men and women aged 15 to 45, victims once again in the prime of their life. And the death rate curve, the mortality rate curve, ended up producing this W shape that you see here on the slide. The strange W curve is what demographers refer to it. You can see the dotted U line, which would start with deaths amongst the very young and fall down into very low ranges for people between the ages of 5 and 65, and then start to rise again. That would have been the ordinary mortality curve for former influenza outbreaks. This W curve is what is so unusual, and again, marks this particular strain of the flu for some reasons that I'll mention in just a minute. In the US, the flu killed men and women aged 15 to 34 at a rate 20 times greater than previous manifestations of the disease. It took more men than women, though pregnant women suffered particularly acutely from the illness and were more likely to die. It seems likely that the virulent nature of the flu virus compelled an immune response in bodies that itself served to exacerbate the severity of the illness. When bodies release toxins to fight the influenza virus, we call these toxins cytokines, they proved so powerful as to destroy lung tissue. In attacking the virus, in other words, the cytokines also attacked vulnerable respiratory tissue, making those enjoying the strongest immune systems the most likely to succumb to illness. Medical authorities could not explain this peculiar character of age and gender distribution of mortality, a phenomenon that contributed to the sense of utter comprehension the disease produced throughout all segments of society across the globe. This was an illness without precedent, whose origins and treatment could not be discerned or determined, and for which there was no treatment, literally, whatsoever. Again, the exception might have been in Asia, where fever-fighting traditional medicines had the effect of, we think, producing lower death rates. The nature of this particular strain of influenza defied all previous understandings of the disease. It struck quickly and without warning, felling people in their homes, in schools, in stores and businesses, and in the streets. As one physician wrote, the patient would be seized rapidly, almost suddenly, with a sense of such prostration as to be utterly unable to carry on with what he might be doing. From sheer lassitude, he would be obliged to lie down where he was or crawl with difficulty to bed. The Lancet, one of the medical journals in Britain, abandoned its scientific distance when it described the flu's invasion of every hitherto safe nook and cranny in the inhabited world. Barracks became converted to sick rooms overnight. Hospitals became so overrun with patients that they had to turn new arrivals away. Nurses and doctors could not handle the unprecedented numbers of cases. Undertakers could not fill the orders for caskets that came streaming in, nor grave diggers handle the volume requesting their services. The flu had a powerful impact on the early 20th century, not only on the families, communities, societies, and nations that suffered such tremendous losses, but also on the politics and economics that characterized the interwar period. Economies suffered from the loss of workers and consumers. Insurance companies faced liabilities greater than those they incurred through wartime deaths. Governments throughout the world were convinced by the experience of the flu to develop and institute public health systems. In the case of South Africa, the Public Health Act of 1919 provided the catalyst for segregationist legislation that would give rise to apartheid. Material and emotional stresses contributed to anti-colonial revolts that broke out in the decade following the war. So let me run through a few of these consequences and events and give you a sense of how this all played out. Although the flu epidemic appeared during the course of World War I and was provided the conditions to spread with the virulence it did by the presence of armies massed in Europe, little attention has been given to the impact it might have had on the prosecution and outcome of the war. But the flu probably had a significant impact on the German effort to end the war through a last massive offensive in the West in the spring of 1918. The Treaty of Brest-Litovsk with Russia in January of 1918 had freed up German troops in the East, enabling their transport to the Western Front for use in what the German High Command hoped would be a knockout blow against the British and French armies. With an additional 1 million experienced soldiers and 3,000 guns, German forces outnumbered those of the Allies considerably, by as many as 4-to-1 in some sectors along the Western Front. British forces had been seriously weakened during the Battle for Passchendaele in 1917, and the French army had suffered not only heavy losses, but was faced with internal disagreement at the highest levels of command. General John Pershing, the commander of the American Expeditionary Force, had refused to commit American troops to the British and French armies. German generals Paul von Hindenburg and Erich von Ludendorff, directing not merely the war effort, but virtually the whole German government as well, realized that they had one last chance to break through Allied lines before the Americans arrived. Their hopes for victory rested upon this final assault. On March 21st, the Germans launched what has come to be called the Spring Offensive. They broke through British lines near San Quentin. By the end of May, the German armies had advanced on the Marne River and established artillery guns that could fire on Paris, leading the French government to prepare to evacuate from the capital. But when Ludendorff ordered a final push on July 15th, his offensive failed, allowing the Allies to counterattack, which they did, beginning August 8th at the Second Battle of the Marne. Joined now by the Americans, the Allies pushed back the German forces till Hindenburg and Ludendorff were forced to sue for peace. The armistice that ended the war in favor of the Allies went into effect on November 11th, 1918. The failure of the German armies to complete their offensive in May spelled their defeat. Most scholars have dismissed the flu as a major factor in this defeat, arguing that because the flu hit all of the belligerent countries with comparable effect at the same time, it had little to do with the German defeat. But one scholar has recently asserted that in fact German and Austrian forces experienced a particularly virulent form of the virus during the Spring Offensive, some 2 months before the disease struck the Allied forces so heavily in August, September, and October. Between the time the offensive began in March until its failure in mid-July, 1.75 million German soldiers had become ill with the flu. More than 500,000 of them in June and July. Ludendorff reported in late June that the flu had struck more than 2,000 soldiers in each one of his divisions. By late July, he attributed his failure to continue the German offensive against the Allies in part to the effects of the pandemic. Historians share the belief that had the German Spring Offensive succeeded, Britain and France would have been compelled to accede to German demands for a peace settlement. Its failure, in light of the debilitating conditions faced by the armed forces and the civilian population at home, virtually ensured an Allied victory once the Americans appeared on the scene. For more than 1.5 million German members of the armed forces had contracted the flu, some units experiencing infection rates of 80%. While on the home front, at home, civilian mortality rates reached their highest for the entire wartime period in October and November of 1918. The German workforce had become weakened considerably by flu between March and November 1918, and their productivity had waned concomitantly. Two American historians have argued that the flu had a decided effect on the American Expeditionary Force as it engaged in its massive campaign against the Central Powers in the Meuse-Argonne battle in late September, October, and early November of 1918. Of the 4 million men of the American Expeditionary Force, at least 1 million of them, 1/4 of American troops, fell ill with the flu, compelling General Pershing to make increasingly urgent appeals to Washington for increased medical support. Influenza exists in epidemic form among our troops in many localities in France, he wrote, accompanied by many serious cases of pneumonia. Request 1,500 members of Army Nurse Corps be sent to France as an emergency requirement. The 88th Division, serving on the front lines, reported that about 30% of its forces had come down with the flu. Of these, 45% died during 1 week in October. The 86th Division saw a 35% rate of illness among its ranks, and within the division itself, some companies saw rates of up to 73%. This meant that replacement troops for those killed or wounded at the front could not be readily found, and the ability to evacuate and treat the wounded was bogged down by the number of soldiers and medical personnel ill with influenza. As Carol Byerly has noted, the influenza epidemic took thousands of healthy men from the AEF rank and file, filled the ambulances and trains, and overwhelmed. Again, this is the bogging down of transport and ambulance equipment and personnel, therefore making it impossible virtually for people wounded at the front to be brought to field hospitals in the rear. Now, the Americans certainly did defeat the Germans in the Meuse-Argonne sector, but Pershing's efforts were considerably hampered by the incidence of disease. More Americans died of disease than of the infliction of bullets or shells. And many thousands of men died who might otherwise have lived had they been able to reach military hospitals equipped to handle their injuries. Very little work has been done on the impact of the flu economically, though two recent articles shed some light on how the loss of so many people might have played out over the short and longer terms. In the first article, two economists controlling for a variety of possible other factors found that the number of deaths caused by influenza in the United States had the short-term effect of increasing American economic growth in the 1920s. This may seem counterintuitive, but a fall in population, especially among those persons in the prime of their working lives, may bring about a shortage of labor, which in turn should drive up wages or income. For every additional death per thousand in late 1918 and early 1919, in fact, the rate of real per capita income over the next decade rose by 0.15% per year. The second article reveals that the long-term effects on children born to mothers pregnant during the outbreak of the flu proved to be measurably detrimental to their economic and physical well-being. Analyzing data from the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, this economist found that those in utero during the flu epidemic attained lower education levels, lower income levels, lower socioeconomic status, and among men at least, significantly higher disability rates by the age of 61. Diabetes, schizophrenia, stroke, these appeared much more often amongst this cohort of men and women. Maternal and fetal health as a consequence of the flu epidemic, in other words, played an important role in economic outcomes many years down the road. The devastations caused by influenza contributed to a variety of post-war colonial revolts. In India, which had been so heavily hit by first famine and then the illness, remember, between 7 and 15 million Indian people died from this disease. In India, as a consequence of these, disturbances broke out protesting British rule. The influenza had struck the Punjab province particularly hard, killing up to 25% of the population in some villages. Think of that, 25%. Conditions in the Punjab following the war made life difficult for a very broad strata of the Indian population. Wages in industries that had prospered in wartime fell dramatically, catapulting much of the population into debt. Impoverished Punjabis often expressed their distress through protests, creating disorder throughout the province. Colonial officials sought and received exceptional new powers to deal with the disorders by means of legislation that enabled the British Viceroy to suspend due process of law and to imprison Indians without trial. This legislation inflamed public opinion in India. Educated Indians of all political stripes submerged their differences and united against these laws under Mohandas Gandhi's civil disobedience movement. Demonstrations took place in a number of cities, and rioting broke out in Delhi, in Ahmedabad, and in a number of Punjabi provinces. When on March 30th and April 6th, when in March, the end of March and the beginning of April, a series of peaceful hartals, a kind of religious general strike, if you will, when these shut down much of the Punjab, rumors of mutinies and plots to end British rule swept through the Anglo-Indian population. Believing themselves to be at risk for assault and murder, British officials and civilians began to arm themselves. There were a series of incidents and events in the beginning weeks of April. And then in the middle of April, on April 13th, 1919, Brigadier General Reginald Dyer ordered a patrol of Indian troops under his command to fire on a crowd of some 25,000 unarmed Indian men, women, and children in the Jallianwala Bagh, a kind of walled garden in Amritsar. About 10 minutes later, their ammunition virtually spent, he ordered them to cease shooting. Hundreds of people lay dead. Thousands more littered the ground. Dyer led his troops from the Jallianwala Bagh, leaving the injured to fend for themselves. The curfew imposed on Amritsar kept would-be rescuers from collecting the dead and getting medical attention for the wounded until the next day. Many died overnight. The Amritsar massacre, as it came to be called, provoked a crisis in British and Indian affairs. For Indian nationalists, it marked the moment at which home rule within the empire would no longer be enough. Nothing less than independence would do, and the civil disobedience movement took off. One of my graduate students, Maura Chun, found in her dissertation that Indian dissatisfaction with British efforts to deal with the flu pandemic in 1919 and well into 1920 had a great deal to do, contributed significantly to the momentum of Indian demands for independence. I'm going to skip over another in the interest of time and in order to get to a question and answer period that we can use fruitfully, to tell you about one last, perhaps the most intriguing possible consequence of the influenza pandemic. This took place in the spring and very beginning of summer of 1919, when the major politicians charged with creating the peace settlement after the war, Woodrow Wilson, David Lloyd George, another one, sorry. Okay, there we go. Woodrow Wilson, David Lloyd George, and George Clemenceau all fell victim to the flu at the Paris peace talks. The physical and mental debilitation suffered by President Wilson in particular played an important role in producing the kind of peace enshrined in the Versailles Treaty, whose punitive nature contributed to the acceptance of fascism in Germany. In January 1918, Wilson had issued his 14 points, principles according to which peace between the belligerent countries should be forged. It was on this basis of the 14 points that Germany had signed the armistice in November 1918. Slide, please, Amanda. Clemenceau and Lloyd George had different ideas about peace terms. They looked to impose on their defeated enemy measures that, in the first instance, would require Germany to pay reparations, that is, pay the Allies for the costs that they had incurred in prosecuting the war, and secondly, to permit the Allies to occupy the Rhineland and the Saar Basin, resource-rich areas of Germany. Wilson determined to defeat such punitive measures and to ensure the creation of a just peace. When the delegates to the peace conference arrived in Paris in the spring of 1919, the third wave of the flu had just peaked. Many of the chief actors and their behind-the-scenes aides fell ill with the disease. Disease continued into April and struck Wilson at a particularly difficult moment in the negotiations. He and Clemenceau had parted ways over the issue of reparations and the French annexation of the Saar Basin. And on April 3rd, it appeared so bad that Wilson almost walked out of the talks. That night, he suddenly came down with the flu, producing a temperature of 103 degrees, a cough so extreme that he could hardly breathe, and debilitating diarrheal cramps. His physician, Admiral Cary Grayson, feared that he would lose him that night. He didn't, but over the next 5 days, Wilson lay prostrate, unable to get out of bed. 10 days after he fell ill, the difficulties standing in the way of an Anglo-American-French agreement on reparations, on the occupation of the Rhineland, and the annexation of the Saar Basin were resolved. France did not get all that it had asked for, but of all the concessions that had been granted, Wilson lost by far the greatest number. Virtually none of his 14 points, save the establishment of a League of Nations, survived. And the treaty that was forced upon the Germans contained a number of harsh terms. The loss of the Rhineland and the Saar Valley meant that Germany's economic recovery would be considerably hampered. Article 231, the so-called war guilt clause, compelled Germany to accept the responsibility of Germany and her allies for causing all the loss and damage to which the Allied and associate governments have been subjected. And it imposed on them the requirement that Germany pay heavy reparations payments. Germany was forced to demilitarize and to cede significant amounts of territory containing German populations. German colonies were ostensibly placed under the mandate of the League of Nations, but were effectively handed over to Britain and France. Wilson's peace without victory lay in tatters. How did this happen? People close to Wilson attributed his failure to insist upon his principles to the effects of the flu. Not only did the disease weaken him physically, it seems also to have produced the same mental symptoms of depression, disorientation, and delusion we saw earlier in the presentation. I never knew the president to be in such a difficult frame of mind as he is now, wrote his secretary, Gilbert Close, on April 7th, 1919. Even while lying in bed, he manifested peculiarities. Wilson's Secret Service agent observed that he never did regain his physical strength, and his weakness of body naturally reacted upon his mind. He lacked his old quickness of grasp, said the agent. Lacking the energy, the intellectual capacity, and even the interest to continue his battle with Lloyd George and Clemenceau, he simply gave in and assented to a peace so unjust that, as he told an aide in early May, "If I were a German, I think I should not sign it." Faced with the prospect of a continuing Allied blockade that had reduced the German civilian population to starvation, German officials had no choice but to sign. The humiliations and material deprivations forced upon the German people by the Versailles Treaty gave ammunition to anti-democratic forces in Germany that would ultimately allow for the rise of fascism and the ascent to power of Adolf Hitler in 1933. I'm not sure you can read what's on that military guy's helmet, but it says Hitler Party. We have the Versailles Treaty producing members of a Hitler Party. This is not to suggest that the influenza pandemic of 1918 and 19 brought about the rise of fascism and the outbreak of the Second World War in Europe. That would be far too direct a connection. What we can do, however, is note the role played by this forgotten pandemic, as Alfred Crosby called it, in some of the most crucial events of the 20th century. For the 1918-19 pandemic was forgotten, disappearing from popular memory for more than six decades following its spectacular visitation upon the peoples of the world. As we've seen, individuals wrote of it in their memoirs and biographies, but public consciousness of the extraordinary losses and the traumas they brought about simply vanished. In the late 1970s, 2 books addressing the pandemic finally appeared, but the significance of the disease in the history of most nations simply did not register. A number of explanations for this historical amnesia suggest themselves. First, the devastations and dislocations of the Great War proved so profound in their consequences that influenza didn't signify. It was upstaged by some of the most momentous events of the 20th century. The Russian Revolution, the dismantling of world empires, the Great Depression, the rise of fascism, World War II, the Cold War, decolonization. All of these events grew out of World War I and commanded the attention and the energies of the world for much of the 20th century. But perhaps equally important, the traumas of the flu pandemic laid bare the inability of nations and peoples to prevent, control, or treat what had come to be regarded as an everyday illness. Science had failed, medicine had failed, governments had failed. And what were people to do with that nasty bit of information? Forgetting about it might just have appealed to publics too frightened to acknowledge so grand a failure on the part of institutions and agencies they had come to rely upon for protection and safety. In 1933, scientists determined that influenza was caused by a virus, not by a bacillus, as they had previously believed. Isolation of the virus enabled clinicians to develop vaccines against the disease. But because the virus strains contain so many subtypes, and because they mutate so rapidly, vaccines are not always effective from year to year, even in the unlikely event that they could be made available to large segments of the world's population. Flu pandemics broke out again in 1957 and 1968, and almost in 2010, the same flu virus that struck in 1918. But none of them struck with anything like the virulence seen in that momentous year. We should heed the lessons that that massive infection and unbelievable die-off, 50 to 100 million people in the space of 6 weeks. We should heed the lessons that that offers us as we try to navigate our current world in the grip of an extraordinary, in its own right, pandemic disease. And now we can turn to question and answers. So I'll give the screen back to Amanda to moderate and hopefully be able to take whatever questions you might have.
Great, thank you, Susan. As a reminder, please feel free to submit your questions via the Q&A interface and we will ask Susan. The first question is from Marianne. She asked, what are the most striking similarities and differences with 1918 and today?
Okay, there are a lot of things that come to mind. This notion of a cytokine storm that I talked about in terms of the immune systems of the healthiest, resulting in massive death rates amongst that group of population. Scientists today, physicians and scientists today are seeing that cytokine storm take place in a number of their patients, again, in that age range of roughly 15 to, let's say, 60 or so, taking more than they had expected. Certainly, we're not seeing death rates in the same numbers, the same magnitude amongst that age cohort that we saw in 1918. But there is that same or similar kind of immune response that is hitting people so heavily in that age range, surprisingly. Secondly, the inability to understand the coronavirus, which I think strikes most of us as just completely incredible in this day and age, was very much the case back in 1918. Physicians had no idea what they were dealing with. They thought it was a bacillus, and so they were very often trying to create vaccines that they had been successful with in earlier bouts with the flu. But since this was not a bacterium, but was in fact a virus which they didn't know about, they couldn't see them until 1933. Any effect at any kind of vaccination fell very far short. They didn't know how to treat this disease in 1918. The kinds of quack cures that came to the fore, cinnamon, cloves, arsenic, sugar cubes soaked in turpentine, anything that, everything was very often put out there, touted as some kind of effective response to the flu, and nothing, of course, worked. So we're seeing some of that floating of quack cures at the highest levels of our government to this very day, despite the fact that, in fact, it looks like that quack cure of hydroxychloroquine is, in fact, responsible for higher death rates from heart failures than we've seen in the past. Governments in 1918 and 1919, especially 1918 in the second wave of the flu, introduced what we would today refer to as social distancing, trying to keep people out of theaters, out of mass areas, baseball stadiums. The Stanley Cup, for instance, was canceled. They didn't keep people out of churches, which had the effect of helping to spread the disease. And interestingly, in the places that took most seriously the orders to quarantine, one of those places turns out to have been Gunnison, Colorado. they were very effectively able to contain the disease. In Gunnison, the city governors, the city fathers and mothers, closed the borders to anyone coming in or leaving, and Gunnison was able to keep itself safe from the ravages of the flu, where in Philadelphia, for instance, quite the opposite happened. People were congregating together in huge numbers, and the city got hit really very, very heavily, very badly. So there are lots of things that suggest themselves as similarities. The very major difference is the nature of the virus. It's not H1N1, it's not influenza. It is a SARS-CoV virus, and we don't know anything about it. Or I shouldn't say we don't know anything. We know a fair amount of things about it, but we are finding out every single day how much we do not know about it and how it is manifesting in various groups, either by age cohort or by geographic location, whatever it might be.
Okay, great. Thank you for that, Susan. We have many questions coming in. We'll get to as many as we can. You had mentioned Gunnison, but Denora also wants to know, how do you compare Colorado in the process of dealing with COVID now compared to how it was dealt with back in 1918, in Colorado specifically?
Right. And well, this would be true of many other states as well, but the response was very often so local as to be sporadic, so that Denver didn't have the same kinds of closing down of events that a place like Gunnison had and could have by virtue of the size of its population. Governor Polis had issued orders that were, by the standards of New York, for instance, relatively mild, but which were statewide in their impact. So back then, when we didn't have effective or widespread state authority or control over areas, the responses would have been far more localized. And that means that variations in morbidity, that is the number of people who got the disease, and then mortality, the number of people who died from the disease, would have been quite disparate by location. Now, having said that, we saw when the governor lifted his order a couple of weeks ago, Boulder County sustained its order, kept it going, where other places, Douglas and some of the other counties, decided to lift some of the restrictions. So it's not an across the board difference. There would have been similarities there too.
Okay, thank you for that. Next, we have a question from Terry. Based on current trajectory, do you feel that our current pandemic will, like the flu of 1918, have 3 waves over a year?
It's impossible to know. The one thing that we seem to think we know about this COVID virus is that it appears to be relatively stable. It appears not to have mutated dramatically the way the 1918 virus did. That is a good sign, if indeed it holds, because it means that if we can get a vaccine, that it will be effective over the longer term. We wouldn't need to change it every year the way we do, for instance, with influenza. But it's virtually impossible to predict what's going to happen, either in the behavior of the virus itself or the kinds of numbers and symptoms we will see coming out of it. We don't have the information. In the 21st century, the most powerful country in the world does not have the data to understand this disease, which I find simply astounding.
Okay, thank you for that. Next, we have a question from Viola. Do you believe that we will experience another trauma-induced moment of historic amnesia with COVID-19?
I certainly think we are experiencing traumas, and we will not, I think, as a society, understand what those do in the long term. That will be left for historians to measure, to deal with. I think in this day and age of social media and the kind of connections we have, the fact that I can speak to 550 people over my computer screen means that there's just too much information to be suppressed in any kind of unconscious way. I think we won't forget this just because we are a far more global world than we used to be. It's not to say we weren't in 1918. Clearly we were, as we were very global, but now we're so connected on so many levels that I just don't think that we will be able to let this thing fall out of our consciousness in the way that it did in 1919. And let's hope that we don't have the kinds of world historical events following this pandemic that we had following 1919, when the entirety of the 20th century was taken up with war and violence and revolution and extraordinary events.
Great, thank you for that. Taking a look at the time, we'll move into our final two questions. Mark was wondering if you could talk more about the ramifications historians have noted that were realized in Spain after the flu was deemed the Spanish flu. And do you have any thoughts on how that could potentially relate to those that would like to call this the Wuhan flu today?
Yeah. I have not encountered in my research a kind of discriminatory set of practices directed against Spain or Spanish people, which is not to say that they don't exist or it didn't happen. I just am not aware of it. And again, because of this historical amnesia setting in, it would have been relatively short-lived. We also would not have had a concerted campaign directed by the highest levels of our government to pin this on a particular country or a particular group of people back then the way we do today. This is a different order of magnitude altogether, what's going on with the attempt to pin this on China or on Wuhan more specifically. And it's directed at a particular political end that would not have been the case back in 1919 or 1920.
Okay. And from here, we'll move into our final question. This question is from David. We've received it from a couple of others as well. Given the evolution of diets and access to food, are the same factors causing minority populations to be more susceptible to the 1918 virus as the 2020 virus?
Certainly in this country, our levels of health and availability of food are far better than they would have been back then, and especially during wartime when rationing, certainly in large parts of Europe, were in effect. But it is the case that indigenous populations in the United States, in Alaska, for instance, before it became part of the United States, in Africa, in parts of the British Empire, got nailed by this disease. And that was a consequence of the conditions in which they lived under colonialism, conditions of deprivation, of ill health, of lack of medical care, lack of governmental response to the emergency itself. So the dynamic, I think, is very much the same in that it looks like African-American populations in this country in particular who do not have access, have not had historically access to the kinds of healthcare and ability to sustain a life in the way that other segments of the population have, means that they're getting hit quite severely in rates much higher than white populations, for instance.
Okay, thank you for that. And thank you so much to everyone for joining us for today's presentation. And a special thank you again to Susan for this great information. As a reminder, all webinar attendees will receive an email tomorrow with a link to the recording of this presentation. To view upcoming webinars as well as previous recordings, please visit our website at colorado.edu/business/alumni. We hope that you will join us for our next webinar, which is tomorrow, as Associate Professor in the Department of Journalism, Dr. Liz Skews, addresses Disinformation in a Pandemic, the Politics of COVID-19. In the meantime, have a great rest of your day and go Buffs!